And there are also traces of this story in manuscripts, journals, photographs, and the minutes of book clubs here in the John Oxley Library collection upstairs. And we're going to guide you in that direction at the end of the session. And of course, you'll also have the chance to ask questions and make your own contribution as you help us to flesh out this bookshelf we're talking about. But first, let's hear from Patrick Buckridge. He's the Professor of Literary Studies at Griffith University with a long-time interest in Queensland literature. He was the co-editor with Belinda Mackay of By the Book, published by UQP in 2007, which is the first literary history of Queensland for nearly 50 years. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Kate. And can I start by saying what a wonderful thing it is that the State Library has decided to celebrate our Queensland literary identity at a time when certain recent signals from the Premier's office might suggest that it's being devalued. So perhaps it's a courageous decision, but I hope not too courageous on the part of the State Library. But does Queensland have a distinctive literary identity? And if so, what is it? In the first half of the 20th century, several attempts were made to define an emerging Queensland tradition in literature. In 1924, the centenary of John Oxley's founding of the Moreton Bay Colony, an anthology of Queensland poetry was compiled by Professor J.J. Stable of the university, the only one at that time, the University of Queensland. Stable was a very active and influential figure in Brisbane cultural circles in the 20s and 30s. He was the founding president of the Queensland Authors and Artists Association, an office holder in several other cultural organisations, and a regular contributor of articles about literature to local newspapers and magazines. His view of Queensland literature was that it was shaped by two opposing poetic traditions, namely the poetry of the bush and the poetry of towns, which were perfectly reconciled during the 1880s in the work of two poets, James Brunton Stevens and George Essex Evans, whom he saw as jointly representing the peak of Queensland's poetic achievement. He wasn't really interested in prose, so this is all really to do with poetry. Since then, according to Stable, and he was speaking in 1924, remember, it had been pretty much downhill for Queensland poetry, though he did express some guarded hopes for its future. Stable's idea that Queensland poetry seemed to involve a constant interplay between town and country landscapes and values wasn't a bad one, actually. There was a lot of Queensland writing still to come in 1924, 88 years and counting, but perhaps that town and country interplay has remained one of the central characteristics of Queensland literature ever since. At the time he compiled his anthology, however, in the early 1920s, it seems very likely that Stable regarded it as part of a much larger project he was coordinating to mobilise literature and the arts to reconcile and to pacify a community, the Brisbane community, in which, in the aftermath of the Great War, social and political conflict had reached dangerous levels. I'm thinking of things like the Red Flag riots in 1919, for example, but there are other examples as well. In that sense, the very idea of a unitary Queensland literary tradition might be seen as an attempt to diffuse the violence of the class struggle, as Stable himself was seeing it acted out on the streets of Brisbane, and in fact he was somewhat actively involved himself on the militia side in those events. In 1930, however, another view emerged, a very different view about the essence of the Queensland tradition, in a book by Henry Arthur Kellow entitled The Queensland Poets. Kellow was the headmaster of the Rockhampton Boys' Grammar. He'd been recruited from Glasgow in 1912. His book is not an anthology, but a full-length literary history, 260 pages or more, with substantial chapters on various groupings of poets from all around Queensland. It's actually a terrific book, I have to say. Based as he was in a provincial city, Kellow was more au fait with the regional diversity of Queensland writing than Stable had been, though he agreed with Stable that the simultaneous presence of rural and urban components in the literature was a very important feature of it. But where Stable had found those contradictory components fully reconciled in the 1880s, Kellow looked rather to the future to bring the diverse energies of past Queensland writing together in a grand cosmopolitan synthesis. He grounded this radical optimism partly in his belief in the prophetic significance of a contemporary Brisbane-born poet, hardly read at all today and not much read even then, whose real name was Charles Bloxage and who wrote under the name of William Balebridge. Critics then and since have disagreed on whether Balebridge's poetry is very good, very bad, or a bit of both, and you can judge for yourselves by that excerpt on the right. The reason for the question mark is that one of Balebridge's eccentricities is that he was never photographed. There is no image of William Balebridge. Nobody knows what he looked like, except for a brief description from somewhere which I haven't provided. Let me just read through that since it's there. The shape I had so oft embraced was sealed up and in earth was placed, and yet not so. For hovering free, some wraith of it remained with me, some subtle influence that brings a new breath to all beauteous things, some sense that in my marrow stirs to make things mute its ministers. I fall before the Spirit so, and flesh in terms of spirit know. The Holy Ghost, the truth that stands, when turned to dust, are lips and hands. It's hard to know what to make of it, isn't it? But it's kind of not bad. That's my view anyway. It was also the view of H.M. Green, as a matter of fact. Kellow, in any case, saw in Balebridge the possibility for Queensland to produce a modern world literature in its own right, engaging not just with local themes and landscapes, but with the great universal questions of human existence. Heady stuff. After Kellow, there is no further attempt to write or even to anthologise the state's literary history until 1959, the centenary of responsible government in Queensland. In this year, 2 books appeared, both products of the University of Queensland and both identified clearly as centenary publications. Cecil Hadgraft's critical survey, Queensland and its Writers, fulfills the terms of its subtitle, which you can see is 100 Years, 100 Authors. He does indeed deal with that many, and it is therefore a slimmer book than might be expected at 120 pages. It is an engaging and useful little book, and its principal aim, as stated in the preface, was the practical one of providing a commentary on our literature for those who are debarred from easy access to the works of many writers whose books are out of print. Like Stables, Hadgraft's study of Queensland literature seems designed in part to defuse some of the ambient political tensions of the day, in his case, the Cold War and the Labor split, by refusing to narrativise Queensland literature at all, except in the lives and works of individual writers. Unlike Stable, who made Queensland literature into a story of peaceful reconciliation between the opposing currents of town and country, or Kellow, who made it a story of scattered energies uniting with the rest of the modern world and thrusting forward to a new future for humanity, Hadgraft makes his 100 writers, past and present, into fellow guests in a large and friendly guest house where lovers of literature can hope to gain some respite from the political ructions outside. At least that's the way I respond to it. In the larger book that appeared in the same year as a companion volume, the Queensland Centenary Anthology, edited by R.S. Burns and Val Vallis, we find an even more marked reticence about chronology and an almost complete abandonment of generic classification and ordering. This anthology comprises some 120 separate pieces, each by a different author. The sequence has no generic or thematic groupings and is only very roughly chronological. There are several dawdlers and queue jumpers. And no dates are given for authors or publications in either the body of the text or the table of contents. It is, as Burns and Vallis observe, a company of the living and the dead, with only the briefest biographical notes at the end to distinguish the one from the other. It's still quite a good read, as long as you're not looking for anything in particular. The 2 most recent attempts to capture Queensland's literary history in a single book have appeared in the last 5 years. The first, by the book, A Multi-Authored History, with Belinda Mackay and I and me, as contributing authors, and Maggie Nolan as one of the valued contributors, came out in 2007. Note the beautiful Margaret Olley cover. The second, Writer's Footprints, a single-authored geographical guide by my friend and former colleague Stanton Millick, came out in 2010. Also a pretty nice cover. I think it's fair to say that while both books tried to be genuinely comprehensive and are both more systematically organised than the 1959 volumes, both of them followed Hadgraft and Vallis in shying away from any attempt to characterise Queensland literature as a whole, let alone investing it with any kind of imminent historic direction or destiny. The keynote in both is rather the sheer diversity of Queensland writing, regional, ethnic and thematic diversity in our book, diversity of landscapes and places in Stan Millick's. This has not, however, stopped a few hardy souls from seeking to identify, define and evoke an authentic Queensland essence which can be detected and recognised in various parts of Queensland's culture, past and present. Two such commentators have been Thea Astley and David Malouf, both of whom began to talk about the distinctive oddness of Queensland in essays and interviews and in their own fiction from the late 1970s on. In a much quoted 1976 essay, much quoted by me anyway, called Being a Queenslander, a Form of Literary and Geographical Conceit, Astley spoke of some of the main ways in which life in Queensland had been and remained different from life in the southern states, and of the reflections of these differences in writings by Queenslanders for more than a century. They include a different sense of distance, a different architecture, particularly domestic architecture, a different apprehension of time, a distinctive preoccupation with personal eccentricity, the Queensland oddball, as she calls it, and perhaps the most important difference of all, a strong sense of cultural antithesis and incongruous juxtaposition. That is, the presence in the one time and place of objects and events from widely separated corners of the cultural field. In a sense, I think Stable's original idea about the simultaneous presence of town and country is a kind of version of what Astley is trying to define in broader terms. David Malouf has embodied those various senses of Queensland oddity in a series of memorable images in his writing over the years about Brisbane and further north. The classical columns of the Treasury building side by side with the mud and mangroves of the Brisbane River. The termini of the old Hamilton-Balmoral tram line placed just a few hundred metres apart across the river as the crow flies, or the seagull. The forbidding wedge of darkness underneath the ordinary old Queensland house. The budding soprano singing arias in a central Queensland shack. It's from one of his short stories. All these impart a distinctively Maloufian strangeness to the same peculiarities that strike Astley as quaint or wacky, but I think they're talking about the same kinds of perceptions. I'd like to finish by telling you about a particular historical instance of Queensland's literary culture which happens to exhibit those same, or some of those same peculiarities of time, distance, personality and cultural antithesis that Astley and Malouf have written about. But it has to do with reading rather than writing. It was a Rockhampton book club called The Book Club, and it came together and discussed several books every week for nearly 10 years, from 1929 to 1938. The unusual things about it were, first, that the members all used pseudonyms, and second, that almost certainly none of them ever met in person, because most of them lived several hundred miles apart. It was, in fact, a virtual book club, hosted first by the Capricornian, which was the weekly stablemate of the Rockhampton Morning Chronicle, and later by its successor, the Central Queensland Herald. It was moderated discreetly and anonymously by the editor of the paper, whose name I've forgotten, who seemed genuinely interested in the ongoing exchanges week by week, and who was no doubt pleased to get what was often a full broadsheet page of copy for free. The 20-odd members of the book club, women on remote western stations, itinerant labourers, and a few townies of both sexes, sought and provided practical advice to one another on sources and choices of books. But above all, they talked with one another talked, in quotes, about the books they had recently read, reread, or just remembered from years ago. The result is a rich, interactive and conversational body of book talk, ranging from simple book lists, plot summaries and gut responses, to sophisticated critical debates, sometimes extending over several months, on particular books, particularly controversial books like Cunardoo and All Quiet on the Western Front, and on topics such as realism, education, race, nationality, the role of personality in literature, and of course the nature and value of reading itself. I think I might stop at that point, but I thought I'd finish with just showing you some excerpts from the exchanges of the Capricornian Book Club in the late 1920s. These are actually both from 1929. They're a little more stilted than some. If I'd gone looking further, I probably could have found something a little more conversational, but this is Quo Vadis, pen name, pseudonym, referring to another pseudonymous member called Ginger, who asks for historical novels of any country. Well, she can't possibly go wrong if she gets A Gringo in Manana Land by Harry L. Foster. The author tells in stirring vein of life and change in Mexico, Costa Rica and Honduras during the latter years, and it cannot fail to enthrall and interest. Numerous illustrations enhance the value of this work. I mean, that's an example of one of the simpler summarising kinds of entries. This is a little bit more, perhaps, argumentative. Ceres, from Ceres. I agree with Ailsa Craig regarding the value of the humorous novel. Its tonic properties are wonderful, especially after a bout of depressing illness, such as flu. Personally, my favourite authors are writers of the historical novel, Sir Walter Scott and Kingsley coming first. But one must have diversity in reading, just as one needs a change of diet for the body's sake. A well-told tale of travel never wearies, and a good racing novel or an Irish story by Hales will neither lack wit nor breeziness. Such writers as G.B. Shaw, with his intense egotism and perverted sense of humour, in my modest opinion, serve no good purpose to humanity. Okay, that's my lot. Thank you.
And we'll draw out more of those stories from Pat Buckridge at the end of the session. But let's turn now to another rich tradition in Queensland, and that's writing by Indigenous people. And Dr Maggie Nolan is Senior Lecturer in Australian Studies in the School of Arts and Sciences at the Australian Catholic University, with a passionate interest in Aboriginal writing. And she's particularly interested in cases of cross-racial impersonation and literary hoaxes. Most recently, she's begun work on contemporary book clubs and the role they might play in promoting reconciliation. Over to you, Maggie.
Thanks, Kate. It's very hard to talk about Indigenous literature in Queensland in 15 minutes because there is a huge amount, so I've tried to kind of shorten what I'm going to say, and I'll be missing out on lots of important things, but I'll have a stab anyway. Indigenous literature in Queensland enlarges the meaning of the literary because it is inseparable from the daily lives of its authors. It is intimately related to Indigenous efforts to achieve autonomy, and it demands recognition of both cultural difference and shared humanity. Although the state of Queensland covers a diverse range of communities, all Indigenous Queenslanders share a history of brutal frontier violence in the 19th century, followed by government regimes of control and surveillance that pretty much govern their lives for much of the 20th century. The literature I want to talk about today emerged out of this context, and I guess to give a sense of why politics and community are so central to it. What I'm going to do is talk about relatively recent literature, focusing on Indigenous life writing, and then have a brief look at contemporary fiction. And really, what follows is a kind of potted overview of some of the writers who I have found most challenging and most interesting, although there are many others besides. Sally Morgan's My Place, which was published in 1986, is often seen as the watershed for Indigenous life writing. Yet Indigenous Queenslanders, especially women, began writing their own personal and cultural narratives of loss and survival under the Act over a decade earlier. Running through these narratives is the effect these regimes had, both materially, in terms of the exploitation of Indigenous labour and the sexual exploitation and control of women, but also personally, as Indigenous people struggle to produce coherent identities, families and communities out of the practices of assimilation, segregation and separation. Some critics have dismissed Indigenous life writing as inauthentic because they argue it reproduces a very European mode of knowing oneself. But this is not a view I share. Indigenous perspectives on their experiences, and which these life writings kind of share, really call for empathy, I think, and respect, and must be understood as acts of testimony and remembrance in the face of forgetting and fragmentation. And the writers insist on their truthfulness. That really comes through in these memoirs. Many Indigenous life stories in Queensland are written by women whose lives began on government missions and or in domestic labour, and who have risen to positions of prominence in their communities. So just to name a few without going into too much detail, Monica Clare's Carabran, The Story of an Aboriginal Girl, that was published in 1978. It's a novel, actually. She refers to it as a novel, but it's based on her own life, and it's a story of almost total dispossession. Although Carabran means togetherness, and there is this kind of, and this runs through a lot of the life writing, this sense that kinship and community might be the threads through which that fragmentation is kind of reweaved. Marnie Kennedy's Born a Half-Caste, that was published in 1985, and it's dedicated to, she says, quote, my mother, my children and grandchildren and my people. And in the preface, Kennedy says, this story is true, it did happen, and I was part of it. And, you know, like other memoirs by Indigenous women writers, the sense of loss that Kennedy feels, the loss both personally and culturally, just pervade the narrative. I'm going to talk a bit more about Ruth Hegarty's wonderful 1999 memoir, Is That You, Ruthie? Because I think it's got some really interesting characteristics worth drawing out. For one, it bears witness for those who cannot, and is written for the many members of her family, she writes, so who, when they read this book, will learn more about where we come from, which will help them to understand who we are. And this is another characteristic of the writing, actually. It's a kind of plea for understanding. So Hegarty tells the story of her life as a dormitory girl at Cherbourg Mission in the 1930s, and like many of the other stories, it recalls the pain of separation from her mother and the exploitation and humiliation of domestic labour. It's also a story that reveals the bonds that were formed at Cherbourg, and running through this narrative is Hegarty's insistence that this is not an individual story and that she's drawing upon other people's stories and memories in order to construct her own. So like many other Indigenous women life stories, and I'm thinking here also of Jackie and Rita Huggins' collaborative Auntie Rita, there is a tension between speaking for the self and speaking for and about the community. That's kind of managed back and forth within these stories. In this sense, Indigenous life writing stands in contrast to the highly individualised genre of autobiography in the European sense. It's like a kind of collective testimony that these stories bear witness to. Hegarty recalls the friendships and fantasies that helped to sustain the dormitory girls, as well as the cold, the hunger, the lack of privacy, the punishments. And she writes, these were the acts of people who felt that frightening us would give us control over them. We who lived through them will bear the scars of this treatment for the rest of our lives, unquote. And yet Cherbourg is this site of real ambivalence. On the one hand, it's a virtual prison. On the other, it's kind of a home. It's a place of love and friendship as well as of loss. And she writes, our family backgrounds and circumstances were very different, but in spite of these very different beginnings, we became a close-knit family whose bonding gave such strength and support that made bearable what could have been a very miserable and lonely existence in the dormitory. One of the most disturbing and fascinating aspects of Hegarty's story is the journey through the state archives. She goes back into the state archives as she attempts to piece together her life from fragmentary documents, turning the impersonal forms of surveillance and regulation into the materials out of which a sense of who she is might emerge. It's quite chilling, really. It's a reminder that the narratives, and everybody's narratives, all stories, are also about power, and the production and storage of documents on individual Aboriginal lives was a key technology for the exercise of state power through much of the 20th century. Some of the most moving passages in the memoir emerge from this disjuncture between her memories and the blunt, callous reduction of her experience in state archives. Yet Hegarty's contemporary memoir turns into this really subversive rewriting of those official state narratives, and it also exposes the official government modes of documenting Aboriginal lives. And Hegarty writes, "Seeing that file there and all the information in it made me realise how much they controlled our lives. How ironic it turned out to be. Here was material I could use to help me write my book." Unquote. In the 1990s, so the 70s and 80s, there were large numbers of, and early 90s memoirs, but in the 1990s there was this surge in the publication of Indigenous fiction in Queensland. And novels were produced by the likes of Sam Watson, Herb Wharton, Alexis Wright, Melissa Lukashenko and Vivian Cleven. And I won't be able to talk about all of them, but I'm hoping to give you a bit of a taste of it. Although diverse in style and scope, this recent writing is marked by a radical reworking of contemporary identity politics and complicates simplistic understandings of an authentic Aboriginal identity, with questions of class, gender, sexuality and regionalism cutting across and producing as well Indigenous identifications. These novels also challenge complacent understandings of Indigenous community, revealing tensions between the rural, the urban and the suburban, and exploring the causes and effects of unequal power relations within communities. And it's really important to note that many of these writers are also significant community and political activists in their own right, with the literary becoming part of that and an extension of it in some respects. So let's start with Sam Watson's The Khadijah Song, which was published in 1990, because it was completely unique in Australian writing when it was published, and it kind of burst onto the scene and no one really knew what to make of it. The novel is compressed into 4 days and set in Brisbane and its surrounds, and it has an energy and a kind of quite brutal eroticism that gives it a sense of urgency. The novel interweaves realistic in the European sense of the word, urban racial conflict, with, for want of a better word, and I'm not that happy with it, but the supernatural, and conflates the present with the past within a contemporary form that has resonances of the genres of fantasy and science fiction. It opens by setting up a cosmology that seems both indigenous and biblical. The white intruders, a fair-skinned tribe, are explained and situated within that cosmology, and the interracial conflict in Australian history is reframed in mythological terms as an intertribal battle dominated by warrior codes and pre-existing laws that have very little to do with European dominance. It's a really interesting strategy, a complete assimilation of European invasion into a totally indigenous kind of cosmology. He's doing something very different here. The Khadijah Song is a deeply contradictory and confrontingly visceral novel. It's quite violent. It's certainly, it made me quite literally squirm when I was reading it. The values of racial purity are in tension with Tommy, the protagonist, as a kind of heroic mongrel figure, and Tommy's attitude it veers between hatred and vengeance, with glimpses of love and reconciliation, if not at least with whites, then at least with the irreversibility of history. Tommy's rejection of all Miglus, or whites, as evil and inadequate, are in tension with the explicit representation of Tommy's whiteness as being one source of potential power. Perhaps the novel suggests, or my reading of it is that the very process of colonisation actually produces such ambivalences. It's almost impossible not to produce ambivalence, and I thought the kind of antithesis you were talking about that characterises the work you were talking about is really true of Indigenous writing as well. This kind of cultural antithesis and holding together of contradictions is really evident in this writing as well. Many of the black characters in Watson's novel struggle with contempt for their own people and what they have become in response to invasion. And the novel also stresses these totally incommensurate systems of law through the well-meaning but ineffective Irish lawyer Jack Finley. Although white law prevails, in the final scene, Tommy Gubber addresses the court. It's quite an incredibly powerful statement at the end of the novel. "I say this," Tommy says, "that you are like empty shells. My land and my spirit are in me, and they are me. This is the way of my people, and this is the way of my law, and you cannot take this thing from me." Sorry, it's a very powerful scene. Fiction is also strongly represented by Indigenous women. Melissa Lukashenko, who's a wonderful writer of Bundjalung, Yugamay and European descent, is a major talent in Australian adult fiction. In addition to her novels, Steam Pigs, 1997, Killing Darcy, 1998, and Hard Yards, 1999, Lukashenko has written short stories, book reviews, political commentary, and is a prominent political activist, although I believe her funding has also been cut. Lukashenko's novels, which reveal a keen ear for dialogue and idiom, that's one of the things she does brilliantly, reading them, is the idiom, share a concern with the complexity of identity, which become in her work an interplay of identifications that cut across race, gender, class, sexuality, age, embodiment, spatial location, all of which are situated in historical processes of colonisation and dispossession. In this way, Lukashenko's fiction expands the meanings of Aboriginality, and while she treats issues of alienation, loneliness, despair, and hope that characterise this time and place, they're very contemporary, she positions these within explorations of issues influencing Indigenous communities and Indigenous women in particular, as they struggle for self-determination in the face of substance abuse, violence, poverty, racism, and the pervasive effects of white systems of law. These novels also have really important things to say about guilt, shame and responsibility, and yet I feel like when I was rereading this, I felt like I was making them sound kind of heavy and depressing, and actually she does all this with a surprisingly light touch. It's quite an achievement, I think, her novels in that regard. I'm not going to talk about Vivienne Clevin, although I do love her, and I particularly love Biting Back, but I know you're going to mention her a bit, so I'll leave that aside, although she's also a personal favourite, because we're running out of time, and you know, as I'm sure you're all aware, no discussion of contemporary Indigenous fiction in Queensland. Indeed, I don't think you could have a discussion of contemporary fiction in Australia, any contemporary fiction, without talking about Alexis Wright, a Wurundjeri woman from the Gulf of Carpentaria. Her first novel, Plains of Promise, was published in 1997 and was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the Age Book of the Year, and the New South Wales Premier's Awards. And it also deals with the search for identity. As you can see, this theme of identity and how you produce a viable and coherent identity out of the kind of devastation of history is just central to this work. It shares the themes of much life writing, stolen children, dispossession, exploitation of labour, sexual exploitation, racism, community and political resistance. It follows 4 generations of women who were torn away from each other in their homes through the practices of assimilation and successive bureaucracies and institutions. Yet this linear and often tragic narrative is set against the story of the land in all its beauty and with its own enduring and cyclical time. So the Gulf and Carpentaria fills and empties across the course of this very long narrative. It's a character in itself, really. The home of a great spirit, she writes, the serpent, the great ancestral creator being. The novel reminds us that this hauntingly beautiful land is alive with ancestral spirits, a dimension of the land that colonisation cannot eradicate. I know I'm running out of time, but I want to very quickly mention Alexis Wright's Miles Franklin Award-winning novel, Carpentaria, published in 2006. I'm not going to try and give you an overview because it is so vast in its scope, so ambitious in its intent, and so eloquent in its execution. There's a dazzling array of characters, a rambling plot. It's about politics and history and spirituality and its damaging shadow, religion, community, the land, conflict, love, poverty, corruption, and many other things besides. It is bleak, puzzling, at times very funny, and all I can really do is to urge you to read it if you haven't already, although I'm sure an audience, as many of you probably have. It's not an easy read, but it is beautifully written, so persist. It deserves and is well worth the effort. The extent to which Indigenous literature has a potential to transform readers should not be underestimated. I think that literature is a huge kind of force for understanding and empathy. And, you know, it's a very kind of exciting time, I think, to be reading and thinking about Indigenous literature. It makes an enormous contribution to contemporary Australian culture and to our understanding of Queensland history, identity and politics. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maggie, and thank you for the reminder too that fiction can be sourced in the archive, and you gave the examples there from Ruth Hegarty. And of course, historical fiction can also be sourced in places like this, here at the John Oxley Library too, where people can go in and find more about their past and then use it in a fictional way. But what's happening, I think, is that we're starting to get, admittedly, a rather complex picture of what writing in Queensland is, and I wonder if we're going to decide in the end that it's defined by contradictions. But I do think that our picture of literary Queensland is starting to take some sort of shape, and our final speaker today is interested in the way writing responds to, or perhaps shapes or is shaped by trauma, especially in the writing of women. Dr Jessica Gildersleeve teaches literature at both Griffith University and the University of Southern Queensland. Over to you, Jessica.
So I'm going to continue a lot of the themes that Maggie was talking about before, and as well as this idea of reading that Pat had already set up. So hopefully this sort of thematic discussion will bring together some of the concerns we've already been looking at. In her short story, The Second Coming of Come By Chance, from 1990, Jeanette Turner Hospital at once mocks and exposes a kind of Gothic strangeness that's often called upon to articulate the Queensland literary heritage. And she says in this story, "At times one has to ask oneself if Queensland is our own Gothic invention, a kind of morality play, the Bosch canvas of the Australian psyche, a sort of perpetual memento mori that points to the frailty of the skein of civilization reaching out so tentatively from our southern cities. One has to ask oneself, does Queensland actually exist? And one has to conclude, I think not." I'm not sure where we are then. Hospital's story conjures the sense in which Queensland figures both the terrible past and the inevitable future of the Australian condition. Its difference reified through what Thea Astley once called, in that same essay that Patrick was referring to, she once called it a kind of federal racism. But perhaps more interestingly, Hospital's narrative also testifies to the sense in which Queensland, as both setting and symbol of traumatic past and anxiously awaited future, Queensland is denied a presence, as ultimately one has to conclude that it does not exist. The Sunshine State, then, becomes a Gothic invention. In the geography of Australia, it fulfills the role of a kind of abject or unacknowledged past, perpetually represented not as it is, but as it is imagined, and thus represented metonymically through its liminal or disaster-ridden topographies, the coast, the bushfire, the cyclone, the flood, the thunderstorm, the tropics, I should add there as well. In the Australian imagination, there is no stable site of Queensland representation. Queensland itself, writes Hospital in another story, Litany for the Homeland from 1991, Queensland itself is fluid in shape and size. It ebbs and flows and refuses to be anchored in space. It billows out like a net that can settle without warning, anywhere, anytime. So today I want to take up this intoxicating Gothic fantasy of Queensland's so-called difference, and to explore how that cultural narrative is put to work as part of an exploration of gendered and racial trauma in contemporary fiction by women. And here I'm going to look at Jessica Anderson, Jeanette Turner Hospital and Vivian Cleven. Anderson and Hospital are frequently examined together, usually alongside their contemporary Thea Astley. But here I want to bring Cleven into this tradition in order to think about the disruptive and radical potentialities of late 20th and early 21st century Queensland women's writing, and the way in which each of these authors is concerned to think through the relationships that are established between marginalised peoples and the land, which here frequently becomes a symbol of traumatic experience and sometimes as well as, a site for escape. So the shift to the Indigenous voice that I'm mapping out there brings us up against an ethical boundary where gendered and racial trauma come into contact, so that the movement from Anderson to Cleven can also be seen to model the increasing association of gendered and racialised histories of marginalised voices. And crucially, these narratives then make the reader part of this ethical conversation as part of a project of responsible reading. And this is kind of picking up on things that Maggie was talking about there. So it opens up debates about shared histories, and especially where these are traumatic. For example, hospitals' narratives demonstrate how even as these texts participate in a task of recovery with regard to the stories of violence perpetrated against white Australian women, these are often bound up with the trauma experienced by Indigenous communities. So in Hospitals, The Second Coming of Come By Chance, that story I referred to first, she tells of the violent gang rape of a young teacher, Adeline Crick, by two policemen, who then attribute the crime to men from the local Indigenous community. These men are fathers of the teacher's young pupils whom she'd been visiting prior to the attack, and those men end up being hanged for that crime. When the lost township of Come By Chance strangely emerges from the doubt-ridden dam, that's what this story is about, the dam is receding and the town is coming up out of its depths. In the wake of what she calls a post-traumatic hysteria that the event provokes, the truth of the past similarly bursts forth from the clumsy tongue of the now-aged teacher, who self-medicates with alcohol in an effort to forget her trauma. Demonstrating women's troubled position as both victim and perpetrator in the history of colonisation, Adeline does not attribute guilt to the policeman, but to herself. She says, "I have the blood of innocent men on my hands." However, this acknowledgement is elided as lurid and gratuitous confession by the Melbourne journalist in whom Adeline confides, so that even as Adeline accepts complicity in the silencing of Indigenous trauma, this fails to be presented as worth bearing witness to, or even anything more than primitive fantasy in the dominant discourse of Southern rationality. And yet Adeline's words have been read, if not by the readers of the age, who shake their heads in dismay at the atavistic threat of Queensland's landscape and inhabitants, but it has been read by us, the real reader, who in the present moment is provoked to response and responsibility. And it's in this way that these women writers teach us how to read, not romantically and through the filter of la belle lettre represented by the journalist's photo essay that was given prominent space in the age, but critically, reading the truth of Queensland history rather than its simulacrum in the Australian imagination. I want now to move on to Jessica Anderson. I'm going to come back to hospital in a moment. But Anderson's most famous text, her novel Tiralira by the River, had started to probe at the sense of woman's gendered experience as traumatic. But in her later work, like Hospital and Cleven, even as these authors endeavour to establish the liminal landscape as a potentially liberatory site, they simultaneously disorder these seeming utopias with realist recognition of the patriarchal discourse which prevents such liberation, thereby figuring through the landscape both that which is desired and its traumatic disruption. So like Tiralira, Anderson's short story, Under the House, is set in the past, and describes a period of revelation in the narrator's young childhood as she begins to see beyond the awe she holds for her older brother and sisters. The space under the Queenslander house and the characterisation of the narrator as child and youngest of her siblings works in part to highlight woman's marginalisation and infantilisation, as she's left behind by her sisters, left feeling imprisoned, put away, discarded under the house, accompanied only by a few broken and forgotten household relics, some broken cobwebby flower pots, the collar of a family dog who'd had to be shot, the leg irons dug up by my grandfather, relic of some poor fellow from the days when Brisbane was a penal colony. The ineffectively buried detritus under the house, part of the domestic present even as it's attempted to be hidden, mirrors Australia's shameful history, so that this small landscape comes to figure a wasteland of cultural trauma. I think they sort of roughly correspond to drought, disease and colonial history, called up by the act of individual memorialisation the story constitutes. And in the story Against the Wall, too, Beatrice finds treasure at the creek. Here she finds broken china, fragments of glass, and a mysterious little rubber bag. And although these objects do not seem to correlate as strongly to the recurring influence of the colonial past as the relics present in the former story, nevertheless, Anderson remains preoccupied with secrets that remain buried, secrets that are disinterred in the present with disastrous consequences, as Bee's mother burns her treasures in disgust, insisting on a kind of unknowing in the present that is in fact impossible, as her daughter's memoir testifies. In Under the House, the family moves soon after to the suburbs and refer immediately to their previous home only as Old Moolalabin. There is no space under the house here, or at least none that's mentioned, and the spectres of the past encrypted in the old house are forgotten. And yet each time the story is read, they are there once again, insistently refusing negation and always already recalled in the memory of the young girl. It's in this way, I think, that Anderson constructs the past as a kind of blockage, rather like the stammer suffered by Beatrice in Against the Wall, something that disrupts linearity as it insists on representation. So to come back to hospital again, in her short fiction, I think she's also concerned with connections between individual memory and shared history, especially where these address trauma. The Last of the Hapsburgs, like another story, You Gave Me Hyacinths, describes a teacher working in North Queensland, and both seek to escape a repressive or secret past, finding solace in the company of young female students and also in water environments, the Gorge in the former story and the ocean and the rain in the latter. These are just two examples then of Queensland narratives by women which display what Vivian Muller has called the transformative effects of wilderness. It's the kind of permission of freedom and imagination that the natural landscape seems to offer in these women's writing. In The Last of the Hapsburgs, Miss Davenport has left a private girls' school in Brisbane after an unspecified messy event, a trauma of exile never named in the story. Invited to dinner at the home of Russian immigrants who've escaped the horrors of war, she learns of the words of silence and the silence of words, as Mr. Weiss lectures her on the work of Isaac Babel, who sought to represent the horror and brutality of war and trauma, and as she listens to the ghostly strains of a violin played by Leo, Mr. Weiss' strangely absent son, and whether Leo is in fact alive and well upstairs or not, neither Miss Davenport nor the reader can be sure. So the Weiss family represent in a very real way the eruption of the traumatic past into the present. What's interesting about Hospital's story, however, is the way in which the language of silence associated with traumatic representation also comes to articulate both female experience and Queensland itself. So Miss Davenport, eager to show Rebecca Wise and her shy Indigenous friend Hazel opportunities beyond the regular afternoon sport prescribed by the Education Board, takes the two girls to swim in the Gorge, a space of green coolness and safety, a place, she thinks, where we have escaped to. In echo of Rebecca's earlier insistence that Queensland is where she and her family have escaped to. Indeed, the water of North Queensland, Miss Davenport thinks at the beginning of the story, is a space beyond available language, a kind of landscape of silence to match Babel's literature. She would need a different sort of alphabet, a chlorophyll one, a solar one. The place will not fit into words. But this utopia is not safe for long. A group of boys discover the girls and shout mocking and lewd comments at their naked forms before one boy defecates into the pristine pool. We will have to stay here in the pool forever, she thought. We are dead ends, the last of a line, masters of the genre of silence. We will have to invent a new alphabet of moss and water. So So in one sense, these final comments suggest a kind of resignation to the silencing of women, reducing their voices simply to mice mutter. However, I think this conclusion also indicates a resolve to persevere in using silence precisely as a form of representation. A new alphabet, perhaps, is one that can narrativise trauma, whether individually or historically. I want now to turn to Cleven's novel Her Sister's Eye, a text which allows us to trace this connection between female and Indigenous trauma in a Queensland context. And while fiction by Anderson and Hospital struggles to articulate a gendered and racialised experience of Australia, coding it as secrets or silence in the narrative, Cleven, on the other hand, seems to deal with it head-on, as this novel describes the revenge sought by the marginalised people of the fictional town of Mundra against their oppressors. At times, traumatic memory is represented in fairly conventional ways in the novel, as, for example, when Archie decides that the truth was something he could not tell her because he didn't even know it himself. There was no memory to prompt why he came to be so scarred. Or when Nana Vida asserts that when you're numb from pain and can't take it anymore, your mind tells you many things. That poor boy put it away so far that he lost himself, lost all or part of his memory. A lot of people survive by forgetting the sorrow in their lives. However, what's more interesting, I think, is the way in which Cleven codes the decay of the past, as well as the event of traumatic return in the Queensland landscape. So the land in Mundra is arid and dead. Everything that was once alive and green died a long time ago, and the dirt seems to have some sort of sickness. The air here is filled with a killing frost. Trees are skeletal and reach out with talons and wiry branches, while the river which dominates the landscape is a violently rushing torrent, which spins and whirls as it bashes into the muddy banks. Small tea trees snag underneath the greedy sucking mouth of the water. The noise is deafening. A coming storm makes Archie's mysterious scar ache, threatening the eruption of traumatic return, and Sophie's terrible nightmares figure a fragmented landscape inhabited by a chorus of bruised whispers. So the buried or unacknowledged past, then, I think, comes back to haunt not so much as a more traditional understanding of a spectre, but in the inescapable landscape itself. And I think it's possible to read this kind of furious landscape as the insistent cry of dispossessed populations, and it's thereby a way for Cleven to recuperate a lost or silenced history, to borrow Carol Ferrier's terms. Her Sister's Eye uses the landscape as metonym for national cultural trauma, forcing acknowledgement of the impact of racial abuse by collectivising the experience of trauma and its return. It's in these terms that responsibility to one's own history is felt and demanded to be heard by all, because, as Nana Vida advises, people need to know their history, otherwise there's this terrible feeling of being lost. So in this brief exploration of Queensland women's writing produced over the past 40 years, I've sought to consider the Queensland experience as a kind of limit space for post-colonial revision and responsibility. Even though narrative representation of turbulent landscapes is clearly not the only way in which trauma is articulated in the Queensland or even Australian or post-colonial traditions more broadly, this reading of the way in which the land offers modes of expression for women writers in this state may help to forge new understanding of reparative strategies in narrative. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for that phrase, the furious landscape. And I guess we now have to welcome ourselves to the Northern Gothic bookshelf of Queensland, which could be a place to escape to, but we can always escape into fiction anyway, can't we? But Pat, I'm still not entirely clear how or even why we need to claim Queensland exceptionalism. Given what I've just heard, I wonder whether we're actually talking about an Australian literature that we need to then talk about in more specific regional and varied ways, particularly thinking about the range of landscape and space in Queensland and how it's understood, and that difference of, say, the far north and its proximity to PNG, to Asia and so on, which is a rather convoluted way of saying, convince me why it's helpful to talk about a Queensland literature.
Kate, I think the main answer to that would be that at various times in the 20th century, people have thought that it was worth trying to identify a Queensland tradition in literature. Whether we think they did it well, or more likely, we probably think they did it in a rather excluding way on the whole. There seems to have been some desire to kind of constitute Queensland as a literary entity as well as simply a political entity. And I think actually something that Jessica said, her point about inventing, in effect, Australia having to invent Queensland as its Gothic other, is probably another kind of answer that if Queensland didn't exist, Australia would have had to invent it, in effect. And Humphrey McQueen, in fact, made this argument in historical and political terms right back in the 1970s, that really Queensland has always functioned in relation to the rest of Australia as not so much as a sort of repository of past ideas, but quite the reverse, as a kind of laboratory for testing out future possibilities, some of those possibilities being pretty unpleasant ones. One might think of Pauline Hanson as a recent example of that kind of political experimentation going on the fringes of the nation, but in a sense for the nation's benefit. See what it's like.
Well, thinking of that then specifically in terms of Indigenous writing, Maggie, I mean, part of what you were talking about referred to traditions that have happened all across the country, particularly in terms of biographical writing. But it is important, isn't it, to talk about the specificity of that lived experience and how it's played out. And I wonder how much of this writing is defined by the Act, as you referred to it, which not everybody will know exactly what you're talking to there. I mean, how much is the Opium Act, the Queensland Act, something that is a sort of theme throughout Indigenous writing in Queensland?
Well, it's a major theme in the life writing, and it's not necessarily a really explicit theme. I mean, not everybody mentions it really explicitly, but the reality of people's lives living under it. So people living under the Act and writing about being under the Act weren't necessarily, talking about a political kind, legislation that was dominating their lives. They were actually talking about it from the other, and I think that's why in Indigenous writing you can really talk about Indigenous Queensland writing, because there is quite a specific state-based history that was quite different to the other states in the 20th century. That meant there was this very shared history of regulation, surveillance, forced assimilation, the mission system. I mean, a place like Cherbourg comes up very frequently as a in the way that I spoke about with Hecate, a very ambivalent space. Palm Island is another location that has is repeatedly referred to with its very specific history. So yes, I think the Act, certainly with the life writing, I would say less so with the fiction, living under that legislation and those sets of legislations, it kind of, it shadows everything, yeah.
I mean, the key factor, isn't it, is the recency of the frontier experience in Queensland compared with the rest of Australia. That there was violence and trauma in the living memory, even now, of people, and certainly in the early 20th century, there was so much of it there, so much, in a sense, needing to be repressed, that people either did or didn't repress it. But it does seem to me that there's a kind of clear impulse in Queensland culture in the first half of the 20th century to sort that out, mainly by kind of writing it out of history, including writing it out of literary history.
And so that's partly talking, I think, about the way that the Protection Acts and so on kept on going until the 1960s. But the other thing that interests me about the way in which Queensland's political history has had an impact on the writing tradition is the number of writers and other artists who left Queensland in the Bjelke-Petersen years. And I was interested that some of the examples you were talking about, Jessica, like Jeanette Turner Hospital, she hasn't lived in Queensland for decades now. So in terms of an invented Queensland, it's an invented childhood Queensland in some senses. I mean, does that change the way in which you think about her writing if you make the case for an invented Queensland, she's really inventing it. I mean, she lives on the other side of the world now.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also the case with Anderson as well, who, even though she was primarily in Sydney, she's still away from Queensland.
And Malouf as well.
Yes, that's true, yeah. And that so many of them are using sort of memoir influences even when they're writing fiction. I think, yes, absolutely, there is a sense of romanticisation about these images of Queensland that is kind of doubled when you're talking about childhood experiences as well. And I was looking back over Forecast Turbulence, which is her most recent collection as well, and I found it even more prominent there than in the stories that I was talking about here. But I think even though they are romanticising Queensland and also romanticising the past, they're kind of aware of it as well, and almost using that as a sort of mode of connection with ways that Queensland is thought about too. So yes, but kind of using it in a useful way. Yeah.
Well, I remember the very first Jeanette Turner Hospital I ever read, which was 20 years ago or something, was Charade. And that had such a strong sense of North Queensland and the sort of sweaty tropics. And so it's a bit cliched to talk about place in literature, but how much for all of you is the Queensland literature grounded in the physicality, the place, the heat, the tropical sense? How much is that central to what you're examining?
Well, for me, the best example of that is Alexis Wright's work, where the land, and particularly the Gulf country, just has a life of its own, and it couldn't be anywhere else. And the connection of the characters to that land, regardless of all the kinds of struggles and squabbles that are happening amongst those characters, the land is this really very real, very grounded kind of place to return to when nothing else makes sense. So I think in her writing in particular, it couldn't come out of anywhere else. Those narratives emerge out of that space in a very explicit way.
It's not really true of Queensland literature in the first half of the 20th century. I think it probably is increasingly in the second half of the 20th century, but really many of the best-known Queensland writers of the first half of the 20th century, people like, I guess, Vance Palmer, we saw him up there, and I was going to say Steele Rudd, but he's actually not a good example for my argument, because one does get a very strong sense of place with Steele Rudd, of course. I think it's a theme that becomes much more prominent in the second half of the 20th century, and that there is a kind of, it's almost at times an effort to transcend the particularity of place in the first half of the 20th century, which to us just sounds synonymous with bad literature. But it's not really. I mean, like that passage, I don't know what people really thought of it, of Balebridge that I had up when I was talking. I mean, I probably didn't read it very well, but there are bits of Balebridge which have nothing to do with the environment, but which are still, in some kind of almost indefinable sense, kind of strikingly good poetry. And that's true of other writers too, I think, that they saw themselves as writing not even particularly in an Australian tradition, but in really a British tradition, certainly an English language tradition. And some of them weren't bad.
And of course that is part of the whole literary history and tradition, is that books speak to each other rather than necessarily to a lived experience or to place. But if we do just linger on place for a moment, I was really taken with that line, the furious landscape. And of course, given that you're interested in trauma in Queensland is also about cyclones and flood and heat. How much is the trauma of where we live. How much is that played out in the work you've looked at? Certainly dramatic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in many ways it's sort of, it's used, so I'm thinking about forecast turbulence, for example. It's used to talk about other things in some ways, but I'm not sure that it's ever directly addressed. It's sort of repressed again in a strange way. And I'm wondering if that's a sort of coping kind of mechanism that we don't really want to dwell on the traumatic past.
Actually, I feel like I should do a plug here for my colleague Ian Townsend, who's written a novel based on the history of plague in Queensland, and he's in the process, and I literally saw him just as I was leaving the office, and he said, mention me. He's doing research here in the John Oxley on the history of cyclones in Queensland, and is going to turn that into fiction, and the material that you can find here and the traces, extraordinary stories of people tracking cyclones in the 20s and 30s. It's fantastic. As soon as you look at it, you think, that should be a novel. Because as a way of exploring the place, it's so interesting. We need to hear from you as an audience very soon, but before we do, I was lucky enough to speak to a historian last night from Oxford, Belinda Jack, who's written a book called The Reader, the history of the woman reader. It's called The Woman Reader, sorry. And Patrick, you talk about the reader. How do we find the Queensland reader? I mean, we've seen some images of readers here. How do we find the reader, and how does that help? How does that transform our sense of what Queensland literature is if we turn our gaze the other way, back from the book to the person who's looking at it?
Yeah. I think it's a very important thing to do, and it's not easy, actually, because on the whole, people read books and set them aside, and that's it. You know, there's no trace of that event having taken place. Sometimes, especially in former times, people would write letters to a friend or to a parent or a child saying, I've just read this book and this is what I thought of it. And these, if we're lucky enough, end up in the personal papers in places like the Oxley Library. And I've done quite a bit of research in recent years hunting up that kind of evidence of people's reading experiences from the past. No, it's hard stuff to dig out. I mean, there are other easier forms of evidence for what people thought about what they read, or what they read even, in the form of, acquisition lists in libraries, mechanics institutes, schools of arts, those sorts of things. But they don't really tell you very much about what people thought about what they read. They tell you perhaps what they borrowed. And you assume they read them, but you don't know what they thought about them. But it's what I think of as the real gold of reading evidence is the sort of personal communications, and sometimes the communications with oneself in the form of diaries and journals. Just sort of putting down notes to remind yourself, perhaps years later, of what you read. And there's a lot of that too in personal papers in the Oxley and elsewhere.
And the history of reading is also, sometimes at least, a history of people being prevented from reading. And I'm wondering how much that's also part of the story for Indigenous people in Queensland. I wondered if that was something that you were interested in.
It's a very interesting question, for sure. I don't even really know where to start with thinking about it, because we know very little about, we know very little about readers and what they do. We know probably even less about Indigenous readers and what they do. So I think this is a really rich and fertile area. I've just recently started a project on book clubs, which is going in and actually asking readers what they've read, what they talked about, what they thought. And what I'm really loving about it is how, they're reading in such interesting and complicated ways, and in very different ways to the ways in which academic readers presume they're reading. There's a lot of discussion amongst academics and worry amongst academics about the reader and what they're doing and what they're not getting, or how naive they are, or whatever. But what readers are doing is so multifaceted, and the next step in that, as part of this project, is looking at Indigenous readers, and there's a wonderful group up out of Townsville, a Murray Book Club up there that I'll be visiting shortly, and going along to some of their sessions and recording some of their sessions, and finding out the question. But that's the number one problem in literary studies, isn't it? Is that we don't know much about the reader. So, and I really love this idea of responsible reading and what that would mean, and how it happens. So
that's why I love the stories of the 1920s book club and people having these discussions. And obviously it was a very Queensland experience, but they weren't talking about just Queensland literature. I mean, it was very much an international discussion, wasn't it?
Very much so. I mean, it's interesting. There is quite an indication there of a number of those readers being quite interested in Australian literature and very conscious that they need to sort of, in a sense, make a case for it as literature that's worth reading, and they get quite sort of passionate about that, some of them. But the majority of them actually are just, reading the stuff from the UK and America and wanting to talk about that. But that particular book club in the Rockhampton newspaper, I think, is a bit unusual. You don't get that kind of thing. I haven't found that many examples of that kind of thing. There is one other example in Western Australia, actually, which I have yet to look into more carefully. But it's all down to Trove, actually, the National Library.
We love Trove. And if anybody here doesn't know what Trove is, when you go up to the John Oxley Library upstairs to have a look at the physical manuscripts, you might also like to speak to somebody and have a look at the computer there and see what you can research. It's transformed the way that historians look at newspapers, it must be said.
I mean, it's about 200 Australian newspapers have been completely digitised from the very beginnings, sort of early, first half of the 19th century up to, I think, 1960, 55, is it? Right, yeah.
But we'd love to hear from you as well, and if you've got any questions, because we are recording this, we'd love to, if you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone, which is just on its way to you, and you can identify yourself or not, it's up to you.
Yes, my name is Anne White, and I just was surprised that in the Aboriginal literary heritage, no mention was made of Kath Walker.
Yes, you're quite right. I suppose I decided to focus on life writing and fiction, and poetry would be a whole nother set of stories, but you're quite right. I should have been given an hour.
To me,
but she's crucial, absolutely.
To me, crucial in life studies,
yeah,
because of how she portrayed with such simple words. I always remember with Namatjira, we boomed your art, and we boomed your art, and I've forgotten it.
But yes, I mean, I agree, and also because she was
broke your heart, and that was so simple, so powerful.
Yeah. Yes, I can only say I completely agree, and I think also because she was such a prominent activist as well, like many of the writers. So,
Tua culpa.
Yes, indeed.
And in fact, there may be other examples of Queensland writing that you think you want to mention, that you just think that's so exciting, that's so important. So feel free to do that as well. Are there other questions or comments?
Louise Danoon from the library here, and I suppose it's a very library question in a way, but I'm interested in, does, as part of our collecting responsibilities, we're to collect Queensland authors and to collect what the output is of Queenslanders, and it's a really interesting issue as well, because it's, when do you collect? Does Queensland literature have to be written by a Queenslander, or is it something that's set in Queensland, or is it both? Or, because there are, and we've got some of the librarians sitting here too who are agonising about those sorts of selection decisions. And so I suppose I was just sharing our dilemma with you, and interested in your thoughts of people who've actually studied the texts, looked at the material of, what are the boundaries around what Queensland literature is in a concrete collecting way.
I came across that very problem when I was thinking about this as well, and the problem of distance that Kate brought up before. I guess I made my decisions based on what it could tell us about Queensland as well. It might be by a Queensland author who's living in Queensland, but if their concerns seem to be nothing to do with Queensland, I don't know. I guess it would probably still be in your catalogue. It might be useful there, but I'm not sure what it could tell us about the way that texts speak to other texts, like Kate said. Yeah.
But something like speculative fiction or SF and those other things, I mean, that Khadijah Man is an interesting example as a way to talk about the Indigenous experience and do it in a completely imaginative way.
Yeah. But still very grounded in place. I mean, Brisbane is very alive, and Boundary Street is very alive in those. And the same with Alexis Wright, where on the one hand it's very set in country, and on the other hand, I mean, she's repeatedly, I'm not sure if I share this, but she's repeatedly compared to people like James Joyce in her writings. And talking about your question earlier, the novel ends with a kind of cataclysmic flood that basically wipes out the town, and it's what that means in the context of the novel are, it's hard to know. So yeah, it's.
Well, and I just read the work of an emerging writer based in Brisbane who writes SF about a noir-style unicorn hunter. He's a Queensland writer. He's very much part of the emerging writers scene here. How much running around chasing unicorns in the dead of the night tells us about Queensland? I mean, I think it is a really interesting question. I mean, Patrick, do you put people who are writers in Queensland who are writing about something that's not at all explicitly Queensland?
Yeah.
Where do you place them?
As you were talking about the unicorn hunter, I was thinking, I wonder if this guy read Dal Stuyves's story, The Unicorn. Dal Stuyvens has no Queensland connection. He's a New South Wales writer, but he wrote a well-known story called The Unicorn, involving a unicorn hunter. But Belinda McKay and I faced the problem of who to include in our history, of course, and we did sort of worry about that. I'm ashamed to say I'm a little hazy about what we finally ended up using as criteria. I think it was something like people who were born in Queensland or who spent a significant period of their lives in Queensland, and I was about to say, or who wrote about Queensland never having lived here, but I don't think there are any such people, probably. But no, it was...
Patrick White or...
well, of course, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Well, we didn't include Patrick White, so I guess that was the decision.
But it is it's a very present debate. I mean, it's being played out at the moment in terms of the Miles Franklin Award and people debating whether Anna Funder's novel is a reflection on Australia, which I would have thought by situating Australia in the world and its history that it does do that, but some people very strongly feel that it is not an Australian novel. So I guess, again, that gets back to what does it mean to write in Australia, in a multicultural country where we are part of the world and there are all these different influences.
I thought that whole debate about the Miles Franklin thing came to a head with Frank Morehouse not getting it for Grand Days, and that after that they resolved, never to exclude anyone on those grounds again. But from what you're saying,
but
that's not the case.
Outside the actual people making the judgment,
I see,
it's very much alive with people saying love the book but don't think it represents the Australian experience. So it's a quite interesting one, I think.
It depends on the lens you use. When you're reading, are you... I mean, for example, a guy who writes about a unicorn hunt, I'm quite happy for that to be considered as Queensland literature, but I don't think you need to do a Queensland analysis of it. You know what I mean? I'm a big fan of pushing boundaries, I guess, rather than setting them in place.
Well, and as somebody who's only been in Queensland for about 6 years, one of the things that I've noticed is how vibrant the writing community is here, and that it seems to be very good at connecting with its audiences and being involved in quite innovative projects. Like they did a 24-hour writing project in the writing centre here with a whole series of writers from all over the country came together and they wrote a novel in 24 hours and published it. And there's all sorts of things. It feels like a very vibrant place for literature.
Well, all three universities have creative writing programs, and that probably adds something to that. And they often run public competitions. Sorry, all three universities. And here's Maggie sitting here, who comes from the fourth one.
It's a different kind of a more national thing, I suppose. But I mean, we offer it as well. Simon teaches actually.
Ah, right.
But I think there was another question over here, I'm sorry, which I've managed to speak over the top of. I thought I saw somebody. It was Joan.
Yeah.
Here's a...
Thank you. This was more a comment about reading. I mean, I haunt bookshops on the weekend, and I guess one way to know what people are reading is to have a look at what they're buying, but also I'm really fascinated by the ebb and flow of material in bookshops. You know, suddenly, vampire novels are popular, and I can just see an ebb and flow of popular, I suppose you could call it dreck, but I'm fascinated by looking at it come and go.
And female porn at the moment.
Yeah. I don't know if you've got any comments on that, or you could almost wonder whether, if you could get hold of the computer records of bookshops and publishers, whether you'd have a very good source of information about what people are reading.
Or possibly local libraries might give you an even better sense of what people are reading rather than what people are buying, giving away, and or feeling they should read. Because they now publish those lists of bestsellers next to the lists of the highest number of books that are borrowed from libraries, and they don't quite connect. It's quite interesting.
I think actually the bringing on the e-reader and e-books will actually give us that data about how people read. There was something on Radio National when I was driving somewhere about, well, they know that it takes 7 hours and 15 minutes on average to read the Hunger Games. They can tell you which is the most underlined quotes that people are reading and so I think that it's interesting actually that the e-book environment will give us more, whether they read to the end, whether they don't. No one knows that.
Kindle knows what you're reading. It really does. You don't have to tell them
what you're reading, but like you say, how they're reading, which is a really another set of questions.
I mean, the other thing you can do, of course, is you can set it up artificially. I was involved in a project about 18 years ago, so a long time ago, where I and a couple of other colleagues interviewed, I think it was 25 people from around the Brisbane area about their reading habits and preferences and memories and so on. But then, as a second part of the project, we gave them 3 books and said, read these and we'll come and talk to you about them in 3 weeks, which we did. And that was the second part of the project. And that drew up, I've always thought, some very interesting results about how people read. I mean, we went in there with certain hypotheses about how certain kinds of people from certain kinds of professional backgrounds would read recreational fiction. And interestingly enough, our hypotheses were disproved. They didn't read the way we thought they would or thought they might at all. But that's a fairly artificial kind of a situation where you're getting people to read in order to talk to them about it.
Again, I think we come back to the contradictions at the heart of both reading and trying to examine Queensland literature. We really need to wind up our Out of the Port session here at the State Library and on RN. But to extend your interest in the area, can I suggest that you have a look at the original material related to reading and to literature in Queensland that's upstairs right now in the John Oxley Library Reading Room on level 4. And that's also where I believe our panellists have agreed to go, for those of you busting to keep talking to them, because always at the end of these sessions there are some extra questions that people are too shy to make publicly. But I should say that our speakers today were Pat Buckridge from Griffith University, Maggie Nolan from the Australian Catholic University, and Jessica Gildersleeve from both Griffith and the University of Southern Queensland. I'm Kate Evans, and thank you so much for joining us today.